Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to talk about classical Indian philosophy and its salient features. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy in School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. So, hello viewers. Today we'll be talking about classical Indian philosophy and its salient features. So, to begin with, so first of all, we need to know the meaning of the term classical as it appears in the phrase classical Indian philosophy. Classical is generally supposed to mean something referring to ancient past. This is how generally people think of the meaning signifying the term classical. But it's much more than that. So what we need to this probably could be better understood by the fact that when we make a distinction between classical music and other forms of music, then we realize that classical music is supposed to have a certain form, certain pattern that is invariably followed, is supposed to have a particular structure which is manifest in any particular sort of performance of it. So when we are talking about classical, this word comes from another word, classicism, which basically means any formalized or systematized thought pattern. So when we sort of keep that in mind, we realize that there's a reason why we call ancient Indian philosophy as classical Indian philosophy. So here, quite contrary to the beliefs that we found propagated elsewhere in the world, ancient Indian thought system had a proper sort of well-formalized arguments, very systematic arguments where reason was followed, was given due respect. We had certain schools which were based completely on logic. One such system is Nyaya. So the very term Nyaya in Sanskrit means logic. So in that sense, we find that when we talk about classical Indian philosophy, so structure of the argument, what counts as a good argument, what should be the rules of arguments, these were very well formulated, and there used to be a particular way in which debates used to be organized. There used to be a particular way in which people, two different thinkers belonging to two different ways of thinking would converse with each other. And also, unlike in the West, there were different schools of thought. And most of the thinkers would belong to one of these schools or the other. That wouldn't mean that you would steadfastly hold on to whatever has been said in that system. There was ample scope for critiquing some of the tenets in the system. There was ample scope to look at them in a different way, in a new way, without deviating completely from some of the main tenets of the system. So, so the point that I want to sort of bring home here is that since the term classical signifies certain kind of formalization or systematization of thought, we find ample evidence of that in ancient Indian philosophy. And other thing that we sort of need to know about why Indian school of why Indian Indian philosophy is called classical, is because there is an effort here, very visible effort, to present an overall systematic framework of explanation pertaining to some of the most fundamental metaphysical questions, like ranging from origin of the universe. We find surmises of that on that in Rig Veda, in what is known as Nasadiya Sukta. So this is written in verse form, in poetic, in the form of poem, and we find very philosophical inquiry into the nature and origin of the universe. So the very first verse begins by saying, how could there be a being or non-being before the universe came into existence? So in a certain way, it even problematizes the very notion of being and non-being. So we have metaphysical, we have inquiries regarding metaphysical questions ranging from origin of the universe. Then there are some very serious inquiries into the nature of causation, whether there is one fundamental stuff of which the entire universe is composed of, or each particular thing has an independent existence of its own. So we have very interesting debates regarding causality, causation, and also different experiential aspects of human condition. What do we mean by that? At the end of the day, what matters, I mean, like most of the systems of Indian philosophy, classical Indian philosophy, are soteriological in nature. We'll discuss that point later on also in the course of today's discussion. Most of the inquiries are goal oriented. In the sense that at the end of the day, there are certain aspects of human condition which require to be addressed to, which require to be thought about, and which require certain kind of betterment. So there are some deep philosophical thought that has been spared for these issues. Especially well known is this Buddhism regarding that. So they talk about these four fundamental truths, and the first one is these are called the Arya Satya, and the first one is that there is suffering in the world. So similarly, most of the schools of philosophy, classical Indian schools of philosophy, do spare some serious thought to different experiential aspects of human condition. So after having discussed the term classical, as it appears in the phrase classical Indian philosophy, I think we need to look at another important word that occurs in this phrase, which is philosophy. So, and we could begin probably by looking at the dictionary meaning of the term philosophy. So according to Oxford English Dictionary, philosophy means the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, and the basis and limits of human understanding. This considered as an academic discipline. So, if we look at this definition and go back to classical Indian philosophy, we find that there are very deep, serious discussion on the nature of knowledge. Apart from many other issues that have been taken up, one of the main things that we find there is that there's a very clear distinction between cognition, belief, and knowledge. These are three very different concepts if we look at them from the point of view of philosophy. Cognition means merely seeing something, which could be true or untrue. Just like we see water in a desert under the influence of in a situation of mirage, which is not there. So all seeing is not tantamount to knowing. So mere cognition means just seeing. So, and all seeing is not knowledge. Similarly, after seeing something, we form a belief, like there is water over there. Now again, this belief could be true or untrue. So that needs to be verified. Our belief needs to be verified before we call it knowledge per se, before we term it knowledge per se, before we deem it as an instance of knowing. So, and there are different terms for that. The term jnana, which in Hindi is generally taken to mean knowledge, does not have the same connotation in Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, the term jnana means an act of cognition, a mere act of cognition, which could be true or untrue, depending upon sort of later verification. Whereas the term for knowledge is prama, which means verified instance of knowing, or another way of putting it could be justified true belief. So a belief which has certain justification and which has known to be true. So there are two different terms for mere cognition and for knowledge. When it comes to the term reality, as it occurs in dictionary meaning of the word philosophy, there are various discussions on the nature of reality. We call it ontology. So what constitutes existence? What is the nature of reality? There are ample discussion on that. Another dictionary definition of knowledge, as it occurs in Webster's New Dictionary, is the definition of philosophy is origin, love of, or search for wisdom or knowledge, theory or logical analysis of the principles underlying conduct, thought, knowledge, and the nature of universe. So as we can see, this definition is slightly different because when we look at the etymological meaning of the term philosophy, it comes from two different words, philo and sophia, which means love for knowledge. So, and also sort of it signifies some kind of a wisdom. So, what is the difference between mere knowledge and wisdom? If we look at it closely, we sort of we may be able to understand that wisdom occurs after some kind of realization about the world. So, knowledge is not just factual in nature. It has a certain ethical value attached to it, which is signified by the term wisdom. So, knowledge leads to wisdom, which is a very important part of any philosophical discussion. And if we look at this meaning also, then we find that in Indian philosophy, there is always a reason for inquiring into something. So, say for example, Mimamsa Sutras begin with the phrase Athato Dharma Jigyasa, which means, therefore, let's inquire into the nature of Dharma. So, there are certain reasons, why you want to inquire into the nature of Dharma. So, which basically means ethical conduct and, what should constitute as a right action, and so on and so forth. So, there are very very serious discussions on the issues regarding what constitutes right conduct, what could be different sort of ways of getting wisdom, which would ultimately lead to some kind of liberation. So, if we look at this definition of philosophy as well, we find that classical Indian philosophy fulfills most of the criteria or most of the notions that we generally carry in our mind when we think of the term philosophy. Another important point that we could probably discuss here is that the term for philosophy as used in classical Indian texts is darshana. So there were 6 schools of Indian philosophy, as is well known, and they were called Shad Darshanas. So darshana, the term darshana is much less categorical and much more fluid than the term philosophy. So darshan basically means, its etymological meaning is seeing. It could also probably be taken to mean ways of looking. As a matter of fact, in Buddhism, there is this term used, drishtis. So there could be several ways of thinking about the world. So each darshana represents a certain way of surmising about the world around us. Each darshana represents a way of philosophizing or thinking about or making sense of the world around us. So that way, the term darshana is much broader and much more accommodative in comparison to the term philosophy as it's been used in the West. So and also as I've told earlier, in classical Indian philosophy, there is a range of issues. So which like just as it's mentioned in the definition given in Webster's New World Dictionary. So there are discussions on conduct, thought, knowledge, and the nature of universe. All these things are amply discussed in classical Indian philosophy. So from here we could move on to the next topic. Another thing that probably we could discuss as a part of this session is that if we look in the West, if we look at the way philosophy thrived in the West, we find that after Greek period, for a very long time until the advent of Enlightenment, we find that philosophy seems to be going hand in hand with theology. So here we need to understand what we mean by theology and how it is different from philosophy. So the meaning of the term theology as it occurs in Merriam-Webster dictionary is the study of religious faith, practice and experience, especially the study of God and God's relation to the world. So as I said earlier, for a very long time, for nearly I would say 1,000 years, if you look at the history of Western ideas, then philosophy was going hand in hand with theology. So for a long time, thinkers were mainly discussing or reaffirming what Aristotle had said for a very long period of time, because Aristotle's thought were very much in keeping with some of the basic tenets expressed in the Bible. Say for example, according to Bible, there is a definite point of time when the entire world was created, and then they have a linear notion of time, and there would be at some point a day of judgment, and so on and so forth. So and apart from other things, Earth is supposed to be the center of the entire universe. So for a long time, philosophers, most of the thinkers were saying things only which were in consonance with these ideas. And in earlier times, in earlier Greek times, it was mainly Aristotle whose ideas were very much in consonance with the biblical ideas. So, therefore, for a very long time during medieval period in Europe, the difference between philosophy and theology was not very clear cut. Whereas, if you look at Indian philosophy, there is a proper place for reasoning, and apart from that, in Indian philosophy, philosophical thinking is not subservient to theology. What do we mean by that? Whatever you are saying, whatever arguments that you are offering, are not necessarily related to some ideas regarding God. As a matter of fact, among Shad Darshanas, there are very few texts available in ancient Sankhya system, where we find certain ideas related to God. And there is one prominent work which is Udhayanacharya's, who was a Nyaya philosopher. One of his works named Nyaya Kusumanjali. There he offers several arguments to prove that God exists. Apart from these two instances, the ideas pertaining to existence of God were not taken very seriously. Instead, the issues which have been prominent in most the texts of Indian philosophy are the nature of knowledge, sources of knowledge known as pramana, what constitutes the truth of a particular instance of knowing, how should we verify the truth, and so on and so forth. So, in classical Indian philosophy, we do not have discussions always which are subservient to theology. And also, there is no strong appeal anywhere to unsupported beliefs or appeal to faith. So you don't find any sort of many instances of that. So any belief that one may have needs to be justified, needs to be verified for its truth value, and only then it becomes a case of knowing. Also, as something that I have discussed earlier also, there is a very well pronounced distinction between presentation, appearance, cognition and knowledge in classical Indian philosophy. So, we need to understand that if we believe in a world outside of us, and there are many realist schools in India, so it is believed that there is a world outside which presents itself to us. So, world presents itself to us as it is. This is what constitutes presentation of the world for us. All right, and from our side, we would say that world appears as so and so. So, from our side, it has an appearance of being so and so. And this results in a certain kind of cognition which we verify for its truth value, and try to find justifications for it, and only then it's raised to the platform of knowledge per se. So, so there's a very clear distinction between mere presentation of the world, appearance of the world, cognitions based on that, beliefs formed on those bases, and knowledge per se. So, we do not find many instances where strong appeal has been made to have faith in God or to have faith in this matter or that matter. Any position regarding any particular philosophical issue are well argued and are and are discussed, making an appeal to reason. So, there is a very clear-cut distinction between philosophical discussions and theological discussions in Indian philosophy. Next to that, probably we could discuss dialogical and tolerant nature of debate in Indian philosophy. So, there were very clearly well drawn rules regarding how a debate between two different philosophers belonging to different ways of looking at the world should be conducted. And what is important here to know is that most of the philosophical works in classical Indian philosophy begin with a statement of opponent's position. So, whenever you are defending the tenets of your own philosophical system, you most of the time begin with the Purva Paksha, as it's called, which means what are the questions that the opponent has raised against the views that I hold. So, Purva Paksha is stated not not as a weak position, but in most of the philosophical works, we find that opponent's position is stated in the strongest terms possible. So, this is called the principle of charity in philosophy. So, it is incumbent upon a good philosopher that you state your opponent's position in the best way it could be formulated. So, and only after you have taken into consideration the objections that the opponent has, and after having responded to them, you establish, a philosopher, a thinker establishes one's own paksha, one's own position on a particular issue, and this is called Uttara Paksha. So, when you want to establish your own views, you cannot do it in a complete disregard for the opponent's position. So, so this pertains to tolerant nature of debate. So, debates were based on mutual respect for each other, mutual respect for the views held by the opponent, and were conducted in a very amicable nature. So, in this particular session, we have learnt about some of the salient features of Indian philosophy, where we discussed the difference between theology and philosophy, and how this very clearly reflected in Indian philosophy, in classical Indian philosophy, and the tolerant nature of debate, apart from discussing the meaning of the term classical and philosophy. Thank you. In this session, we'll be discussing the nature of debate as it used to occur in classical Indian philosophy. Important thing to learn about that is whenever there were debates about any particular issue, it used to begin with the statement of opponent's position, and it was incumbent upon the philosopher to state the opponent's position in the strongest terms possible, which means giving due respect to the opponent's position. And a proper response was supposed to be given to the objections raised by the opponent, and only after that the Uttar Paksha, which means statement of your own views, was done. So this is how the process of establishing one's own views was completed. Now, regarding the nature of debate, probably another thing that we need to discuss here is the structure of a good argument, as it was propounded especially in Nyaya philosophy. So, there is a particular structure which any good argument should follow, and there are different steps that are involved in a good argument, beginning with what we call pratigya. Pratigya is the statement of the thesis to be proved. So, the philosopher, before the beginning of the debate, would very clearly, in unequivocal terms, in unambiguous terms, in categorical terms, would state what is the point that he or she is going to prove or going to provide reasons for. So, pratigya was, or the statement of the thesis to be proved, was the very first step involved in an argument. Second step would be hetu. The term hetu refers to the reasons that one may offer to prove one's own thesis. Actually, the term hetu is translated as reason. So, if you have a particular position, you, as stated earlier, we don't find any appeal to faith for accepting one's thesis. So, in Indian philosophy, in classical Indian philosophy, most of the philosophers would not ask the opponent to accept one's views on the basis of faith. So, instead, proper reasons are supposed to be offered. It has to be a rational inquiry in that sense. So, proper reasons which should be agreeable to both the parties in the debate, both the partners in the debate, coming from different schools. So, those reasons should be agreeable to them, and such reasons should be offered while you are trying to prove your thesis. Third very important step of a good argument is supposed to be giving examples, called udaharan. So, after you have stated the thesis that you are going to prove, you offer reasons, and then you give an illustration, an example, to empirically prove what you are saying. because giving an empirical evidence was supposed to be a very important part of your argument. So if you say so and so, you'll have to empirically prove it that it actually can be seen happening in the world. So that way, an example is a very important part according to classical Indian, the way debates were conducted in classical Indian philosophy. So illustration, for example, is the third and very important point regarding the structure of a good argument. Then the fourth step that is involved in an argument is called Upanaya, which means basically stating the relevance or application of the udaharan to the present case, which basically means that when you are offering an example, it should not be something that is not even related to the issue at hand. So when you're stating reasons, when you're giving examples, these should very clearly be related to the topic in hand. So an application needs to be shown how the reasons and examples that you have offered pertain to the present issue which is being debated. And once we have performed all these three different steps, which means hetu, reasons offered, udaharan, giving examples or illustrating what you have to say, or giving empirical evidence of the thesis that you're going to prove, and demonstrating its application to the present case, we arrive at the conclusion, which is known as nigmana. So, nigman is basically a repetition of the statement of pratigya. So, earlier as pratigya, it was a thesis to be proved. So, there was a particular argument that you had made, which required certain proofs. And in nigman, the same idea comes across as an idea that has been proved, that has been proven. So, pratigya, after you have offered hetu, reasons, udaharan, examples, upanaya, its application in the present case, pratigya becomes nigman, or the thesis proved. After this, probably we could look at the general nature of inquiry in classical Indian philosophy, and how it is different from the idea of philosophy elsewhere in the world. So when we look at the nature of inquiry and some of its salient features in classical Indian philosophy, we find first and foremost that in Indian philosophy, argument for the sake of argument is not supposed to be a good idea. Whereas if you look at the philosophical traditions in the West, we find that knowledge for its own sake is supposed to be a very strong idea. So, one may inquire into the nature of knowledge, nature of ethical conduct, whatever, for its own sake. Whereas in Indian philosophy, any inquiry is initiated with a very clear reason and end in view. So, an inquiry should have a very clear, well-defined goal in view, and argument for argument's sake is called shushk tark, which is not considered very highly in classical Indian philosophy. Third very important feature of inquiry in classical Indian philosophy is that most of the inquiries are taken into consideration for the reason of liberation. Most of the darshanas, most of the philosophical ways of looking at the world, as explained earlier, have a particular notion of what constitutes human freedom. So, as stated earlier, the human nature and human condition surmises on that are a very important part of discussions in classical Indian philosophy. As a matter of fact, there is a very famous aphorism that occurs in Upanishadic literature, which goes something like this: Sa vidya ya vimuktai, which means knowledge is that, sa vidya, vidya is the term for knowledge, sa vidya, knowledge is that, ya vimuktai, which liberates. So, knowing for just the sake of knowing is not considered a very good proposition in classical Indian philosophy. We make an effort to know with a particular end in view. And what is that particular end in view? Betterment of human condition, betterment of one's own life. The ultimate view, ultimate goal is vimukti, moksha or nirvana or liberation. So, so there is a soteriological significance of knowledge in classical Indian philosophy. So, knowledge, one very ineluctable feature of knowledge in classical Indian philosophy is soteriological aspect. What do you mean by soteriological aspect? Soteriological means anything pertaining to liberation. So, knowledge, any discussion on knowledge has its soteriological significance, is not completely devoid of any soteriological significance when it comes to classical Indian philosophy. Another important point is that that the only purpose of conversation is determination of theory with no humiliation of the opponent. This is something important. Whenever certain debates are conducted between different philosophers, the end goal in view is just to establish what actually is the truth. So, the importance is not given so much to winning a point or losing a point in a debate. So, it has to be a rational conversation called ukti pratiyukti. So, any rational conversation is aimed at determination of theory, some kind of agreement to be reached between two opponents on a particular issue, with no regard to with the end of which should not be the humiliation of the opponent or the defeat of the opponent. So, there were no personal stakes involved in that sense. So, these were not personal issues that we were putting at stake while entering into a philosophical debate with the opponent. So, the only goal is to have a mutually agreeable theory of a particular topic in hand. And on the basis of that, there are different type of arguments which have been discussed in classical Indian philosophical texts, especially by the Nyaya school of thought. So, according to them, there could be different ways in which one could engage in an argument with the opponent. First of these types of argument is known as Vada, and Vada is defined as when two opposite parties dispute over their respective theses, in which each of them tries to prove his or her own thesis with reasons. Each of the thesis is called Vada. So, Vad is like any sort of common discussion should take place. So, there are two different thinkers who sit across each other, and they have their respective viewpoints, their respective ways of looking at a particular issue in hand, and they present reasons for their own arguments. So, a good argument should be of this kind, should be of the kind of Vada. Now, as opposed to this kind of argument, we have another kind of argument listed by Nyaya thinkers, which has been called Jalpa. Jalpa has been defined as a dispute in which disputants give wrangling rejoinders in order to defeat their respective opponents by showing fault in their reasoning, like Chala or Jati. So, what is meant by Jalpa is that that Vada is a type of argument where defeat of the opponent is not so much taken into consideration, whereas in Jalpa, finding loopholes and trying to find fault with the opponent's argument is an important part of the discussion. And to understand what constitutes Jalpa, we also need to know what do we understand by the term Chala and Jati. The term Chala signifies or means the intentional misinterpretation of the opponent's argument for the purpose of defeating him or her. So, in Jalpa kind of argument, if your opponent tries to intentionally misinterpret your argument, then you should point it out. So, at times what can happen is that the opponent who may otherwise understand what you are trying to say, but for the sake of refutation may not want to present your argument or her Purva Paksha in the strongest possible way. So, instead what opponent may decide to do is to give an interpretation of your argument which appears faulty, so that he or she already has an edge over you. So, this is considered not a very good way of arguing with your opponent. Second type of Jalpa called Jati Uttara. Second type of wrong argumentation, which in a Jalpa argument you should be able to find out and point out, is Jati Uttara. Jati consists in the drawing of contradictory conclusions, the raising of false issues or the like with the deliberate intention of defeating an opponent. So, at times what may happen is you may have certain theses that you present to your opponent, but even though agreeing with your thesis or the premises that you have offered, the opponent may not be interested in drawing the same conclusion as your conclusion. So, what happens here is that on the basis of certain views that you may have, you may want to draw certain conclusion, and your opponent instead might state that some other conclusion comes to the forth given this very same premises. This type of argumentation is called Jati Uttara, and it's not considered a good way of arguing, because here there is a deliberate intention of defeating an opponent. So a contradictory conclusion is reached by the opponent for the reason of defeating the opponent. And again, as I stated earlier, this is not considered a very good form of argumentation. And last but not the least, there is a Vitanda form of argument, which is another type of Jalpa argument. So a Vitanda is a Jalpa. A Jalpa becomes Vitanda when it is only a destructive criticism which seeks to refute opponent's doctrine without seeking to establish or formulate any new doctrine. So in Vatanda form of argument, what an opponent may be trying to do is, an opponent may be just interested in destroying any position that you may have, any philosophical position that you may have. So what happens here is that you may have certain views regarding a particular theme, a particular topic in hand, and the opponent is interested in doing nothing else but just disapproving you. So the point here is that whenever you are engaging in an argument with an opponent, you must have a position of your own. You must have an idea which you are looking forward to establish. If you are engaging in debate with your opponent without having any view of your own in mind, then it is a mere game, in the sense that you do not have any goal except to destroy whatever your opponent is saying. So if you're only interested in destroying the position of the other without establishing your own position, it's not considered a good way of engaging in an argument with your opponent. And it's not is considered only a form of Jalpa. Moving on to the next topic. Something that characterizes classical Indian philosophy in a big way is the role of Vedas. Vedas, as a matter of fact, there are two different camps to which most of the philosophers belong when it comes to classical Indian philosophy. There are Astik darshanas and there are Nastik darshanas, which is Astikas. The term Astik is translated as orthodox, and the term Nastik is translated as heterodox. Now, this distinction is not based on belief in God or any other matter, but this distinction is made on the basis of whether a particular philosopher believes in the scriptural authority of the Vedas or not. The important point to understand here is, what do we mean by scriptural authority of Vedas, or what do we mean by scriptural authority as such? In order to understand that, we must understand the meaning of the term scriptures. So one easy way to understand that could be that when we look at quote-unquote ordinary literature as opposed to scripture, we may have our own way of reading it. So what happens in cases other than scriptures is that you might have a particular view of your own, which you present forth in a text, and the reader has a complete freedom to look at what you have stated in the text in his or her own way. Whereas in the case of scriptures, there is an additional appeal that the author makes, which is that there is whatever has been cited in that particular work is the actual truth, is nothing short of an actual truth. And when the truth has been already delivered according to the writer, then there may not be different ways of reading it, because truth could have one way of strictly, if when we are like another important thing that we need to keep in view here is that we are talking about some of the highest order truths. So according to Astikas, the most important questions regarding universe, regarding the origin of universe, regarding human condition have already been discussed in the Vedas. So these are the highest order questions, and the answers are already given. So there may not be different ways of expressing them. There may be also there may not be different ways of reading them. There has to be strictly one way of reading these works. So as opposed to that, Nastika systems or heterodox schools of Indian philosophy, which includes Buddhists, Jainas and Charvakas, give importance to human experience. So anything that goes contrary to human experience is not admissible to them. So they do not believe in the scriptural authority of the Vedas. They do not believe that whatever is written in the Vedas, whatever is mentioned in the Vedas, is true by the very fact that it has been expressed in these scriptures. So according to them, we should not believe in whatever has been expressed in the Vedas just for the reason that it has been expressed there. Instead, we should judge it on the basis of our own experience. If it conforms to my human predicament, if it has certain answers to offer to me in terms of my understanding, my experience, my condition in the world, my experiential condition in the world, it is not of much use to me. So this is an important distinction, but also what we need to keep in mind is that orthodox schools, which includes Sankhya Yoga, Mimamsa and later Mimamsa, Uttar Mimamsa as it's called, or Vedanta, and Nyaya Vaisheshik, they offer particular reasons why one should accept Vedic authority, and the reason for that is that Vedas are aparushe, which means they are not of human origin. They have always existed prior to human beings, and therefore because of their aparushe nature, we should accept Vedic authority. According to Nyaya, Vedic authority should be accepted because Vedas are the works of God. So in this session we learnt about the nature of inquiry in classical Indian philosophy, the dialogical nature of debate in Indian philosophy, different kinds of arguments as they occur in Indian philosophy, and Vedic authority in classical Indian philosophy. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching lecture, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.